My name is Joe Murray. I'm a gastroenterologist at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. I'm here today to talk to you about the history and the engagement of the scientific community in celiac disease here in America. I came to America in 1988 not to study celiac disease, but for other interests in GI. However, because I came from Ireland, where celiac disease was both common and well recognized, I got involved in that area. But the 1990s were a scientific desert for celiac disease in the US. There were two or three centers around the country that were making stalwart efforts to engage with celiac disease. But it was never a disease that got much attention, and nor did it gain much funding. An inkling of interest came after a person with celiac disease, visited their congressperson at the Hill, and the congressperson discovered to their chagrin they couldn't provide any hospitality to that patient. Now, those were dark days for celiac disease when there was very little available, little done, and little known about the disease. In fact, it was largely an orphan disease. But due to this one person's engagement with Congress, they sent down a request to the NIH to study it. And in 1997, I spoke at an interagency committee meeting about celiac disease. At that time, I'd been doing a little bit of research on celiac disease and type 1 diabetics. I presented our data, and there were other presenters. And the result of that meeting 2 years later was a call for funding for celiac disease. And indeed, I was lucky enough to gain funding for studying celiac disease where I now am in Rochester, Minnesota, as well as a couple of other grants that were funded. And this was a very hopeful beginning. Next, there was a consensus conference in 2004 that the NIH sponsored. And this drew in a lot of people from both the US and elsewhere. Anybody with any knowledge of celiac disease. It brought in patient advocacy and patients to the fore, as well as what I call a Supreme Court of scientists. These were scientists and clinicians who were not experts in celiac disease, but they were to stand in judgment and determine, well, what's known about celiac disease, what's appropriate practice, and indeed what needs to be done. And they generated a consensus report in 2004 that really identified the gaps of knowledge and indeed the depth of ignorance almost about celiac disease that pertained at the time. But it was a time of great hope and anticipation. And subsequent to that, there have been a number of groups, not many, that have been funded intermittently over those years since in celiac disease. And some have made major contributions to the science of celiac disease. But that community has not been growing. And perhaps more troubling, there hasn't been a lot or a large cadre of new people who are involved, engaged, enthusiastic scientifically about celiac disease. There are a few standout people, but not enough to replace those of us who've been doing this for a long time. And celiac disease was largely considered a relatively rare digestive disease. All of that changed in 2019. And that changed because of one person's engagement with people in the legislature, in our national legislature, to bring to their awareness that celiac disease had a broader impact. It wasn't just a digestive disease, it was an autoimmune disease. And it belongs in that family of autoimmune diseases, and as such deserves a broader focus. And since 2019, when Marilyn Geller, your fearless leader, presented to a appropriation subcommittee the voice of patients with celiac disease, the need for expanding the science and the engagement of the tremendous research potential present in the US and elsewhere to address the needs of this disease and the people who suffer from it, and also the relevance of this disease to the broader community of people with autoimmunity. And since that time, we've had presentations at the committee that helps advise the NIH on autoimmunity. And now, indeed, the CDF has a seat at that table. So they are now considered a bona bona fide part of that table of autoimmunity. And now we're excited that through this advocacy, the NIAID, which is the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, as well as the NIDDK, are jointly organizing a research workshop. And this is an exciting, it'll all, of course, be, because of the times that are, be a virtual workshop. They are going to address the key areas of endeavor in research in celiac disease. Some of this is very basic. It's looking at the lining cells of the intestine. It's looking at basic immunology, but it's also looking at new areas of therapy that could be ways of treating the disease beyond or in addition to a gluten-free diet. So much of this um, will be discussion. It's also bringing people in from other disciplines. It's broadening the reach of celiac disease or broadening the perspective of celiac disease. And a key part to this is to try and engage our younger investigators, our new investigators, to bring them into celiac disease, to think of it as a disease that is both challenging, engaging, and a terrific example of an autoimmune disease that we can understand a lot about and also potentially impact the other autoimmune diseases. Um, and we see this as a colloquium of experts, and hopefully to come from that will be a detailed report, indeed a roadmap for what the National Institutes of Health can do. Why does this matter? Why does it matter to the people with celiac disease? Well, people with celiac disease, you've been living with the same treatment for 70 some years with no progress in other things. We have made progress in terms of recognizing different mechanisms that drive this disease. And this workshop will really identify new potential areas that we can address. But it's through this foundational work that needs to be done that we can build on new ways to detect, diagnose, manage, and treat patients with celiac disease, and ultimately even dream of curing it or preventing it in the first place. And those of you who are familiar with work that I and others have done, celiac disease went from a very rare disease 70 years ago to one that is quite common and may affect, in some circumstance, over 1% of the population. So it's a disease that's worthy not only of our attention, but worthy of the research community's attention and our tax dollars at work. And finally, celiac disease has to compete. It has to compete with the diseases that have already had an established research community. We need light to grow. The little tree of celiac disease research needs a bit of space, and it needs light and fertilization to grow and to be able to compete on the same level as every other disease for the attention of our tax dollars. Thank you for your time.